Okay, think about the biggest, most chaotic shakeups in modern business history for a second. When you hear the phrase rogue startup founder, who immediately pops into your head? You know, the kind of person who just completely shatters the rules, fractures an established legacy organization, and launches this predatory, highly agile competitor. You're probably picturing a Silicon Valley tech titan, right? Well, what if I told you the absolute blueprint for the ultimate corporate disruptor was actually mapped out way back over 350 years ago? Take a guess at who that might be.
It's Satan. Actually, specifically, it's the version of Satan engineered by the English poet John Milton in his 1667 masterpiece. Today, we're going to take this classic text and put it under a completely different microscope. We're viewing this epic not just as, classic literature, but through the highly precise lens of modern business, organizational behavior, and honestly, toxic leadership.
So, welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're hanging out with us today. We're essentially diving into an elite management seminar based entirely on a 17th century epic poem. We're going to break down John Milton's Paradise Lost as literally the ultimate case study in corporate defection, asymmetric market disruption, and just the sheer destructive power of massive executive ego. Here is our agenda for today. First, the restoration market shock. Second, the ultimate corporate defection. Third, asymmetric warfare against Eden. Fourth, anatomy of the toxic disruptor. And finally, number 5, the modern anti-hero blueprint. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the restoration market shock. Now, you really can't understand this text without understanding the incredibly volatile market conditions and the systemic trauma its author survived. Mid-17th century England was a geographic sector defined by, total structural regime change. In 1649, we see this cataclysmic operational breakdown. The English Civil War culminates in regicide, which completely dismantles the traditional monarchical infrastructure. Then comes the Puritan Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, which is this volatile political experiment that really struggles to maintain structural legitimacy. And then, bam, the massive countershock hits in 1660 with the Stuart Restoration. King Charles II returns, reclaims the sovereign throne, and ruthlessly liquidates the previous Puritan infrastructure. And that restoration, it directly impacted our author, John Milton. See, Milton wasn't just a poet. He was a high-level civil servant, essentially the primary propaganda strategist for Cromwell's government. So when the monarchical restoration executed its hostile takeover in 1660, Milton faced total asset liquidation. He was stripped of his public assets, arrested as a high-value state dissident, and basically forced into permanent political obscurity. Impoverished and entirely blind, he leveraged his intense isolation to dictate Paradise Lost. He essentially converted his deep, real-world political grief into a mythic masterwork. Talk about a pivot, right? But to pull this off, Milton had to seriously innovate. Older, classical models from guys like Homer and Virgil focused outward, on physical geographies and imperial trade discoveries. Milton, on the other hand, pivots the entire macro narrative inward. He focuses heavily on institutional rebellion and internal choices. Plus, he directly challenges his classical competitors by completely severing ties with medieval rhyme structures. Instead, he introduces unrhymed blank verse, giving the English epic this totally new, fluid rhythm. It was a real game changer. Moving right along to Section 2, the ultimate corporate defection. So with that architectural foundation laid, we are dropped into the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic corporate civil war in heaven. Lucifer is the organization's most brilliant, highly ranked executive asset. But when headquarters appoints a new CEO, the Sun, Lucifer unilaterally defects. He flat out refuses to accept this supreme authority. Operating under his rebranded identity of Satan, he mobilizes a full third of the corporate workforce into an open, high-stakes institutional rebellion against headquarters. Now, obviously, a rebellion against an omnipotent central administration doesn't exactly end well for the rebels. They are decisively defeated by an overwhelming monopoly of force and cast down into a highly volatile sector known as Hell. Which brings us to Section 3, asymmetric warfare against Eden. Down in Hell, Satan starts building his counteroffensive. Refusing to just accept passive stasis or total liquidation, he displays some immense strategic resilience. First, he coordinates his top-tier generals inside a newly constructed corporate headquarters called Pandemonium. Think of it as a prototype hub to consolidate dissenting capital. Second, recognizing that a frontal assault on headquarters is just literally impossible, he shifts tactics. He targets a pristine new subsidiary enterprise called Earth. Third, he bypasses their external security grids to infiltrate this ecosystem, executing a high-level social engineering operation on the fresh human assets Adam and Eve. And fourth, he triggers a devastating compliance breach.
So what exactly is that compliance breach? Well, it's targeting the baseline protocol of the new enterprise, the single, solitary restriction forbidding consumption from the tree of knowledge. Using incredibly sophisticated psychological manipulation, Satan convinces the human assets to execute a deliberate breach. The immediate consequence here is catastrophic systemic failure. Sin and death are violently injected into the ecosystem. The human capital completely loses its pristine asset status and is formally expelled into a volatile, high-friction world. Honestly, Satan's asymmetric strike is just devastatingly effective.
Let's dig into Section 4, Anatomy of the Toxic Disruptor.
Now, why does he do it? To really grasp that, we need to examine the underlying psychology of this radical disruptor and his complete inability to adapt to a shifting corporate hierarchy. It's all perfectly synthesized in one famous manifesto: better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. I mean, this is the historical prototype of the radical disruptor's manifesto. He values absolute individual sovereignty far, far above any kind of systemic alignment. But notice something crucial here. His disruptive energy isn't actually productive. It's totally cynical. It's a reactive force driven primarily by wounded narcissism and just immense pride. And this leads us to a really profound diagnostic on internal alignment. Later on, Satan famously declares, "Myself am hell," meaning wherever he transits, he carries his own toxic environment with him. Because he cannot seek reconciliation and because he cannot execute a viable exit strategy, he is locked into a permanent psychological feedback loop. Your psychological state dictates your reality, right? Well, this loop of diminishing returns ultimately degrades his character completely. It takes him from a magnificent archangel down to a low-level crawling serpent. It's a total downward spiral.
And finally, Section 5, the modern anti-hero blueprint. So what is the ultimate legacy of this ancient tale of corporate defection? Like, what should we actually take away from all this today? Well, in the 19th century, romantic poets and narrative architects realized something really profound. Milton had inadvertently laid the structural foundation for generations of complex antagonists. By crafting such a deeply psychological, fleshed-out portrait of a defector, Milton accidentally made the rebel the most compelling asset in the entire text. He literally created the structural foundation for the modern antihero. But the legacy goes way beyond just literature. It bleeds directly into modern organizational behavior. In today's hyper-competitive ecosystem, this 17th century text remains an elite reference grid. It is the ultimate management case study for analyzing executive turnover, leadership defection, and asymmetric market disruption. Satan operates exactly like the toxic rogue founder who splits from a legacy corporation to launch a predatory competitor. It shows us exactly how pride, ego, and severe communication breakdowns fracture global organizations and liquidate massive systemic value. It's an absolutely powerful framework to keep in your back pocket as you watch modern business headlines unfold. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Next time you see a rogue founder loudly defecting from an established legacy company and disrupting the market, ask yourself, are they genuinely innovating the future? Or are they just locked in a toxic feedback loop, building their own pandemonium? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes open for those disruptors out there.